everybody. Okay, so we've already focused a lot on the different parts of speech, and now we're going to focus a little bit more on punctuation. So I don't know about you guys, but I oftentimes have trouble distinguishing whether or not I should be using a comma or a semicolon or a colon, just because they all seem to kind of indicate the same thing, like this sort of pause. So we're going to examine those three different types of punctuation marks in a little bit more detail, and in this session we're going to focus a little bit more on commas. So let's take a look at some of the rules that we have for when to use a comma. The first rule we've already talked about when we talked about sentences and compound sentences. The first rule says that we use a comma to separate two independent clauses in a compound sentence that are connected by a coordinating conjunction, like our fanboy words, for example, for, and, but, or, nor, or yet. So let's take a look at the example that I have here. The first one that I have is I ran to the beach, comma, and then I jumped into the sea. As you can see, we have two independent clauses. I ran to the beach, and I jumped into the sea, and they're separated by the coordinating conjunction and, as well as a comma. Now, I think I had mentioned this in our module on compound sentences or sentences as well, and I had said that if one of the independent clauses was really small, then it wasn't actually necessary to use a comma to separate them. So if you take a look at the following example, I'll show you what I mean. We ran into the living room, and he sat. So we ran into the living room as one independent clause, and he sat as another. But because he sat is such a short independent clause, it wasn't actually necessary for me to use a comma to separate them. The second rule that we have for using commas are that they're used to set apart introductory words, phrases, or clauses. So if you take a look at some of our examples, you'll be able to see what I mean. The first example is annoyed. The teacher stood quietly at the front of the room. You can hear that little pause after I say annoyed, and we would use a comma after the word annoyed to kind of offset the rest of the offset it from the rest of the sentence. In the next example, we have the phrase smart for his age. The 2-year-old can read. Again, as you can see, we kind of have this little pause after we would say that. In this case, because it's an introductory phrase, we would use a comma to offset it. Now, the third rule is actually a list of 8 other things that we would use commas to offset. So we would use them to offset interrupting words or phrases. For example, my dog, the small one, is cooler than his. The small one is a phrase that's kind of interrupting the rest of the flow of the sentence. And we would use commas before and after it to offset it. For the second thing that we would use it to offset is a direct address to a person. So when I'm speaking to someone, I'm always going to use a comma after their name. So Whitney, comma, what are you doing tonight? You can actually hear that pause after I would say Whitney's name. The third thing would be we use it to offset interjections. For example, uh-oh, he's in trouble now. It's a phrase that my students use a lot. We would use, after you hear uh-oh, you hear like a little pause. In that case, we would use the comma to kind of separate the interjection from the rest of the sentence. We would use it in contrast to offset contrasting expressions. For example, the clown at the party was for the kids, not the adults. Once again, you can kind of hear that I would normally, in normal speech, I would have a little pause before I said not adults, indicating that it's a contrasting expression, and we would use a comma to offset that. We would also use a comma to offset a comment that could be in parentheses. For example, he, unlike she, loves to run. So unlike she could actually have been in parentheses. We don't have to use them. We can actually use commas to offset that expression or that phrase. Number 6 would be things in a series, which I'm sure you're all pretty familiar with from grade school. For example, you'll need paper, comma, pencil, comma, and a calculator for the test. So this is a series of things that you would need, and you would always use a comma to separate the things in a series or list. Number 7 would be the parts of date or an address or title. So for example, we have January 2nd, 1985, or another example would be a title. Maybe you would put this at the end of a formal letter, at the bottom where your signature is. You might have John Doe, comma, CEO, or for me it would be Adrienne Supino, comma, ELL teacher. We would also use them in an address. I'm sure that you all know how to write out your address on an envelope, so I didn't feel the need to add that in as an example. And last but not least, we use commas to offset greetings in a letter or an email. So after your greeting, for example, Dear Abby, you would always put a comma before going down to the next line to begin your letter or your email. So I hope that helps explain some of the rules for commas and helps to clarify when you might use them.